And tonight on PM Express, a conversation about Ghana's debt to GDP ratio, which the World Bank is projecting to hit 104% by close of year. It's in its latest African Pulse report. How did we get here? Well, the World Bank is largely blaming the Bank of Ghana for delay in introduction of monetary policy measures to deal with worsening economic indicators, especially inflation. Is this a reasonable projection, knowing that our debt to GDP ratio 6 months ago was about 78%? What will cause this drastic change? And what will happen if we finally get there? Let me share with you details of the latest report of the Africa Pulse. And this is how it puts Ghana. So first, debt to GDP ratio by end of year. And we're looking at some African countries. We are comparing Ghana to Eritrea, Sudan, Cape Verde, Mozambique. And if you look at this chart, you will realize that Ghana is number 4 on that chart. Why do we compare Ghana to South Sudan? To Sudan, it's not possible because Sudan is a war-torn country. We shouldn't be comparing this, but Ghana is on number 4. Now look at this one, the ratio projections from 2022 to 2024. Again, you have from 2017 and 2018, which is almost close, 55.50% and 57.60%. Come to 2019 and 2020, there's a little difference, 62.40% and 76.10%. Then in 2021, 2022, almost close, 77%, 78.30%. Now look at this projection. This is where our conversation is going to center on. The World Bank is projecting that by December 2022, we'll hit 104.60%. This means that we're spending over 100% in paying our debt. Now, 2023, it projects that it will come down to 99.70, and then in 2024, pick up 101.80%, probably because of elections. Now, this is according to the World Bank. In Ghana, the central bank delayed interest rate hikes until inflation soared from 13.9% in January 2022 to 19.4% in March, followed by a massive depreciation of the CEDI. Now, this is how the currencies in some countries have worked. And again, you have South Sudan, you have Sudan, Malawi, and then you have the CFA franc. And we are comparing the CEDI to all these countries, and you realize that Ghana has lost its value. The CEDI has lost its value to 60% compared to other countries. CFA franc has lost its at 13.30, but Ghana lost it at 60%. Look at the CEDI to dollar depreciation, and you have from 2017 to 2022. 2017 it stayed at 4.90%. 2018 8.39%. 2019 15.70%. So it went up a bit in 2019, and then 2020 came down to 3.90%. Look at 2021, 4%, and that was marvelous. Now just look at the gap. 2022 we are at 60.00%, and this is where the projection is coming from. So prepared jointly by the staff of International Development Association and the International Monetary Fund. I'm talking about the latest report we're talking about, and it was approved by Marcelo, the IMF. Now, it's a joint bank fund debt sustainability analysis. Those of you who say that COVID came in to make us a risk of external debt distress, this is the projection in 2019, and even before COVID hit us. It says risk of external debt distress high, overall risk of debt distress high, granularity in the risk rating sustainable, application of judgment no. Okay, so let me explain this further. Fitch downgraded Ghana to CC. What does a CC mean? It means that default is imminent with little prospect for recovery. That is what a CC means, and that is where Fitch downgraded us too. So in cases where countries' debt is assessed as unsustainable, the IMF is precluded from providing financing unless the member takes steps to restore debt sustainability, including by seeking a debt restructuring from its creditors. And tonight we're focusing on this conversation. You may know that there are negotiations with the IMF. Is this kind of projection going to affect our negotiations with the IMF? Is a debt restructuring on the table? Tonight, I've been joined by Dr. Kessiel Atoforsen. He's a ranking member on the Finance Committee of Parliament. I've also been joined by Professor Eric Osei-Sibe. He's Associate Professor of the University of Ghana. And I've also been joined by Dr. Theo Champon, who is a political risk analyst. Let's have a conversation after this break. Welcome back to PM Express. My name is Ayisha Ibrahim. I've been joined in the studio by Kessiel Atoforsen, Dr. Atoforsen. I'm grateful that you were able to make it. And on Zoom, I've been joined by Professor Eric Sibe, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Ghana. I've also been joined by Dr. Theo Champon. He's a political risk analyst. I'm grateful, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Ato. Considering the fact that 6 months ago, our debt to GDP ratio was at 78%, as against a total debt of 393.4 billion. How did we get here?
Aisha, first to start with, I do not believe that 6 months ago Ghana's debt to GDP was 78%. I don't believe that. For a number of reasons. We have constantly made that statement that Ghana's debt to GDP is not properly accounted for, in the sense that we have identified what we call hidden debt. A typical example is when you use ESLA revenues for the purposes of collateral and to use it to take a loan. And we believe that per the nomenclature of the ESLA receivables itself, its corresponding debt should be part of the public debt. The government had consistently decided to ignore us. We believe that the ESLA debt is public debt and should be captured as such. Same as the Sino-Hydro, when the government for some reason decided to classify it as barter trade. And I wonder that in this modern day, we still have a barter trade and you use it to bypass the fiscal accounting mechanism. For some strange reason, government insisted. But I had said that if you are to factor in ESLA bond, the Archie bond, obviously the Sino-Hydro, and that of Road Fund, our public debt to GDP as at end 2021 was 81%.
Okay.
And this is not secret. I've debated it on the floor of Parliament. I've written articles to support the position of the minority. We wrote even to the IMF to get them to do what is right when Ghana was in a program. And yet the government decided to ignore us. So I'm not surprised at this report. If you ask yourself, how did we get here? For me, reading the World Bank document, they have not said something new.
Okay.
They have said something that all this time we are all aware of. But unfortunately, Ghanaians are not listening to us. The minority in Parliament has raised this issue constantly. We have been very, very consistent on this matter. For some strange reason, the country has not woken up to the fact that that is where we are going. Let me put it this way. If you go to the Central Bank website, as of June, they will say that the public debt to GDP is about 70-something%. But you see, that is misleading. That is complete misleading for a number of reasons.
How?
Number one, the debt stock itself accrued a number of debt. An example is that the central bank itself has lent to government and classify it as overdraft, yet it is not part of the debt stock in question.
Okay.
So the 22 billion that the central bank has given to the government excludes. It's not in the debt stock, so you have to add it back. If you have to add ESLA, Sino-Hydro, and Dachi Bond and Road Fund, the amount in question is far more than what they have quoted as the nominal debt number.
Okay.
Then again, the issue of expressing this as a percentage of GDP. You know what they do all this time? You see, when you are comparing, you compare like with like. You have projected GDP for end year 2022, and you have the actual debt. So you have actual debt as at June, and you are using it to compare a projected GDP for December. So the denominator is bigger, it's overstated. So what you should have done is that they should have compared it to projected GDP for the same period of June. So the number is misaligned. And that thing there is misleading, and have consistently raised an issue with it. I had calculated, and I recall 2 weeks ago, I had come out to say that Ghana's public debt as a percentage to our GDP by end year is somewhere around 100%. I said this because per my own model, I have added all of this hidden debt, the debt that they have put under lock and key in a cupboard and some of them under a sofa. I brought all of them out and added them to the public debt, and I had about 100%.
Okay.
So I'm not surprised that the World Bank is coming out with this. Maybe because it's World Bank, people are listening more. We have been saying this thing all along, and that is why today I can boldly say that from the numbers I have seen, and by calculating Ghana's ability to pay, our debt is simply unsustainable. Nothing more, nothing less. We can talk about it, but in the end, we'll come back to the same thing and say that our debt is simply unsustainable. You can use any model, it's not sustainable.
So this 104% projection, what could really cause this drastic change?
Okay. So basically, a couple of points. The hidden debt is now coming out. So things under the carpet and under the sofa and all of that's now coming out. That's one. And then two, the cedi depreciation. Obviously, the foreign debt, if you express it as a percentage, if you convert it into local currency and if the cedi depreciate, it's going to move up. And government attitude. Government attitude. When revenues are not coming, instead of you cutting expenditure, they go to the central bank and get them to print for them and increase the public debt. Today, they are failing to add to it. But you see, there's a limit to what you can do. By the end of the year, you have to securitize it. And if you securitize it by the end of the year, it can't hide. It will add to the public debt. And it will certainly become unsustainable. So you can hide to me. But of course, when the IMF come or the World Bank is doing analysis and they ask you the question, at that point you can't hide it because you have to bring it out. So what the World Bank and the IMF have done is that they've swept under the pocket. They brought all the debt under the sofa and what they have put in their armpit and all of that, they brought everything out and we are getting 104%. So you see, if we had stopped them from hiding the public debt, we would have known that our debt is unsustainable. Pressure would have been mounted on them and decisions would have been taken to bring it back to sustainability. But because all of us sat, even though the minority was raising concerns, everybody felt that we're doing politics. But you see, the situation has passed politics. We need to secure our country. We have to do whatever it takes to get the people in office to start acting. The situation is terrible. In fact, terrible is an understatement. The situation is sorry. Ghana's situation calls for all of us to take decisions that will preserve the future of our country. We are not in good position at all. Debt has become a major national concern. We should address it holistically, look at what is actually driving the debt. We all know, what can we do to change our lifestyle? We are living a champagne life on an appetition budget. You see, we are living above our means. How do we do that? Because of our attitude. So, it must stop.
Professor Eric Osibe, I indicated earlier, and Acho also corroborated to that on the Bank of Ghana's website, if you log on to the Bank of Ghana's website right now, you would see projections from January just to June, which is the first half of the year, and which gives you 78% of GDP ratio. Now, it also gives you a total debt of 393.4 billion. Looking at this projection, is it a reasonable projection?
Well, it could be yes, it could be no, depending on where one is coming from.
I mean, why? All right, so
the central bank is
okay, so we seem to be having a terrible connection with Professor Eric Esibe.
that bring direct costs or debt servicing costs to government, where government has to pay on yearly basis. Hello?
Prof, you're on PM Express. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, Prof, I can hear you loudly. Let's try and fix Professor Eric Esibe's.
Can you hear me?
Let's try and fix his line. There's a connection problem there. Let me bring in Dr. Theo Champon. He's a political risk analyst. To those who say it's an alarmist projection, what's the reality on the ground?
I don't think it is an alarmist projection. Like Kesel said, for anyone who's been paying close attention to the numbers and looking at the trajectory of where our debt has been going in recent years, you could actually almost get to the point of getting between 95 and 100% debt to GDP. The thing, though, is that you have to look at how it's treated within the different sort of accounting identities. So typically what we have sometimes done is that when we're computing the total public debt, of course, we add the external and the domestic, but we don't fully account for the debt that is owed by the state-owned enterprises and some of the off-balance sheet transactions and things like that. And that had actually been a major issue that the IMF had flagged in some of our programs that we've engaged in, including in the last one that we just exited. And we even had a challenge with this above the line and below the line reporting. So if you look at what the World Bank does, and on page 35 of that report, they state, and I'd like to quote this one here, that the debt is expected to jump in Ghana to 104.6% of GDP from 76.6% a year earlier. And they give three reasons for this. One, they say that there's going to be a widening government deficit. Number two, the massive weakening of the CEDI. We're talking in excess of 40% depreciation year to date. And then number three, rising debt servicing cost as what is driving these numbers. And I would like to sort of pick the first one on the government deficit. The finance minister went to parliament a few months ago with the mid-year budget. The government said they were going to be doing 7-point-something% deficit by the end of the year. But as of half year, we had already done in excess of 6, right? That then leaves you a gap of about 1.5 or 1% thereabouts. And what that then means really is that you have to do major cuts to your expenditure in order to be able to meet that original 7.6%. But as we speak currently, if you look at the fiscal projections and the numbers coming through, we are way above or beyond those numbers that have been brought or raised by the finance minister a few months ago. So I don't think it's an alarmist projection. In fact, in any case, we do have the IMF in town now, which is doing the debt sustainability analysis, and that's going to feed into the program design. And I won't be surprised if in the final DSA that the IMF does, we would end up with a similar debt, stock and debt to GDP numbers, because they would include a number of the things that typically would not include in our debt accounting treatment, including those off-balance sheet transactions, and then the exposure at the exposure on the state-owned enterprises side of things. And just a quick point here before maybe I hand over. The IMF would only lend if they are sure that a country's debt is sustainable. And they have a statement on their website, which I'd like to quote here again. And it says that, quote, for those countries that have unsustainable debt, the IMF is precluded from lending unless the member takes steps to restore debt sustainability, which includes debt restructuring. And to determine whether your debt is sustainable or not, there are 4 bands that they typically would do in the DSA analysis. You're either classified as being low risk, moderate risk, high risk, or in debt distress. And as of last year, when that DSA was done in July, we were already classified as being at high risk of both external and overall debt distress. So given where we are now with the extra deficit and the extra spending, I personally won't be surprised if we move up into the next category of already being in debt distress, which then means that we would have to fundamentally commence a debt restructuring exercise before accessing the IMF financing.
Thankfully, Professor Eric Esibe is back on the line. Prof, you were earlier explaining why you may see it as a reasonable projection or not, depending on where you're coming from.
Yes, I think that's exactly what my colleague, Dr. Theo Champon, has mentioned. Depending how you want to look at the various debt components, if you are seeing it as one that brings direct burden on government in terms of servicing, or the one that already has some streams of revenue inflows that is self-financing, and the one that is deferred, I mean, in terms of its repayments. But when it comes to the IMF or the World Bank, they have a wider debt coverage by way of the debt sustainability framework that they use. And so if you look at the World Bank framework, they will normally would cover the entire public debts, both guaranteed and non-guaranteed debt, that will usually would include the non-guaranteed state-owned enterprise debt, will be part of it, the local government debt, if there are any, obviously they will want to keep that as part of it. And then also, if there are any even non-concessional debts, like the Sino-Hydro facility, as Honorable mentioned, obviously they will capture it since comes with some kind of obligation, but all government may not capture it because government may not see it as immediate obligation to repay, since the repayment is actually in the future. It is a loan that is backed by collateral for future bauxite and sometimes processed aluminium on exports and what have you. So the burden may not be immediate, so government may not capture it, but the IMF or the World Bank debt sustainability analysis will take that, since it's an obligation that has to be paid, whether now or in the future. The issue of the financial sector cleanup costs, or the materialization of the contingent liabilities in the energy sector, that legacy debt, which in the past or presently the government may not capture directly, the IMF DSA will definitely capture that cost, which the financial sector cleanup that is adding about 4.6% of GDP, thereabout, and the energy costs adding about 1.5 or so. All of that will be added to your debt stock, as the case may be. And then the debt sustainability analysis will also often take into account scenarios pertaining to your GDP, what your GDP is likely to be like, the projected GDP based on shocks, based on what is happening in the economy, based on your financial situation, the primary balance, your exports, volatility, the commodity prices. They'll take all that into consideration, and also your exchange rate. How is your exchange rates going to be? Whether it's going to depreciate further, which imposes extra burden on you, and a host of other factors that the government may necessarily will not consider. So putting all that together, then you can be sure that your debts to GDP will go much higher than what the official figures will be. And that has always been the case from the time immemorial that we started going to the IMF. The IMF DSA will always give you a bigger debt obligation than what the official figures will say.
Well, one of the things that the ordinary Ghanaian will be looking out for is how this whole thing will affect him or will affect his pockets. Dr. Theo Champon, earlier you indicated that this is not fiction. It's actually a reality. I'll come to you to explain to me what this, the effects this will have on the ordinary Ghanaian. But of course, why? Government has explained to us that COVID has come in to hit us. We have Ukraine. There are other issues that have affected the economy. So what if we get there?
Ayisha, first, any time I hear...
And Ayisha, are you asking me? Should I respond?
No, this is to Ato, Prof.
Okay, all right, great.
Ayisha, anytime I hear things like COVID, Ukraine, it sounds like music in my ears.
Is it?
Look, COVID never affected only Ghana. Okay? Ghana obviously isn't an island. We have our neighboring countries. How could COVID skip Ivory Coast, Togo, Nigeria, and everybody and hit Ghana? Why is it that the Ukraine war is not affecting our neighboring countries, but it's only affecting Ghana? There's something fundamentally wrong with our Ghanaian economy. Let me make a point. If the government had decided to correct their attitude of hiding public debt, wouldn't have gotten to where we are getting to. If the government had stopped their attitude of always creating SPVs for the purposes of hiding public debt, even though it is the central government that is actually having the obligation of servicing those debts, certainly wouldn't have gotten to where we are. Ayisha, one important point we need to understand is that there's difference between the debt stock itself and the debt sustainability analysis.
Okay.
While the debt stock talks about the stock of debt, the actual debt you owe, the DSA deals with going forward, including policies that you will implement in the medium term, including some signings of loans that you are yet to draw down. So the two are different. It is a fact that the Sino-Hydro is a public debt. They decided to exclude it. Today, Ghana's debt, Ghana's debt to obligation to Sino-Hydro is due next year, June. Where's the bauxite? Where is the bauxite? How are we going to pay for that debt? Remember, the bauxite revenues are actually part of the tax revenue. So if you are using bauxite revenue to service a debt, it is part of the central government obligation. And the Constitution is clear on this matter. If you draw from the consolidated fund for the purposes of paying a debt, it becomes a public debt and it should be captured as such. It is government attitude that has gotten us there. No government in the last few, since 1992, this republic has decided to hide debt in the magnitude that we are seeing now. It has become the stock in trade of this administration. Let's call them out. If they have erred, let's call them out and make sure they don't repeat it. This attitude of trying to say that, yes, because that is what is happening and always this is going to happen, trying to rationalize it, will not help us. Where we are, let's confront the problem as it is and deal with it in a manner that we will not repeat it as a republic. Because I am worried, because clearly, I don't know the model the IMF will use. But the model that I have used as an ordinary person, a legislator who has some experience in the work that we do, Ghana's debt, toss it, roast it, put it in an oven, head it, maybe do whatever you want to do with it, is simply unsustainable. That is a fact. So they can do all sort of analysis, looking forward, do some whatever analysis they have to do, but I can assure you that in the end, we'll come back to the table that Ghana's debt is unsustainable. Then that comes to the question. That will mean we will need to do something. Something before we get an IMF program. You agree with me that Ghana need IMF program as early as yesterday.
Yeah.
In fact, we needed it yesterday. They have delayed in getting a program to bring the stability that we all want. But unfortunately, the debt has become an albatross on the neck of the Republic of Ghana. Our debt has become an overhang. Ghana's debt situation is a distress. I call it sovereign insolvency stress. Ghana, as we speak, is going through what I call sovereign insolvency stress. We are simply insolvent. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is to take a decision to restructure. But the question is, what kind of restructuring? That is the kind of conversation I believe we have to go in.
We'll come to the
kind of restructure that we will do that will safeguard the economy and preserve us going forward. I believe that is where we've got to.
It's something that we will look at, whether restructuring is on the table. And I know today you met the IMF team. What really transpired and what is their stance after this projection? But let me come to Professor Ayisha Ibrahim once more. Does this have the likelihood of affecting our negotiation with the IMF?
Well, absolutely, it will, in a sense that once new figures are coming out. As was said earlier on, for an IMF program, you always will look at your debt stock and how sustainable that is before they advance any or they enter into any agreement with you. So once what is actually holding on to the agreeing on any numbers is because of this DSA that is still not out yet. But once that is out and the numbers are clear, whatever agreement that they will enter into will be informed by that, right? And so they already have factored that into the analysis that they will not reach any agreement yet until the DSA is out and the numbers are clear. That would inform how government is going to respond, what is the measures government going to take to make sure that the debt levels are sustainable before any program will be entered into at the end of the day. So it may not necessarily prolong it, but it will help to facilitate the process, in my view. Once the numbers are out and they are clear on the numbers, then it will behove on government to come out with a plan, a program as to how it intends to ensure that the debt levels are sustainable in a way that will not compromise the stability of the economy and also limit government's ability to provide social and developmental needs for the country. So once these numbers are out, I'm not sure whether this number is coming directly from the DSA. I'm not quite sure about that. But if it is, then of course it's going to help the negotiation team to reach some kind of settlement or agreement early enough for the country.
Having met the IMF team today, how would you assess our negotiations so far?
I think, yes, we met with FUN this afternoon. They indicated to us that they are coming to the end of this mission. They've been here for almost 2 weeks, and I'm sure tomorrow they will address the press before they leave. And clearly, they have not arrived at a conclusion yet, because it's only 2 weeks. And the first thing they needed to do is to conclude the debt sustainability analysis. So I asked the question as to whether they have concluded. What they said to us is that they are yet to conclude the debt sustainability analysis. Okay. For a simple reason that the DSA, you would need more than just the abstract numbers, the stock of debt. You need policy, at least in the medium term. Yeah. The medium-term policy is what they are discussing with government. For example, they will need a policy such as the contracting of loans. So if there's a limit on the contracting of loans, say $500 million, then that is what they have to input it per annum over the next 3 years. Yep. Then if, for instance, they are going to say you are going to do a fiscal deficit over 2% or 3% or whatever, if it's 10%, you have to input its impact in the DSA. Okay. So until they get some understanding of the policies from government or based on the agreement at the high level, what they have to do, it will be difficult for them to conclude the DSA. They went further to say that they hope that the next visit where the Ministry of Finance and government negotiation team will visit them at the fund, they will be able to maybe finish the DSA. Okay. But I can say that they have largely an idea what the DSA situation is. The only thing is that you recall that IMF is a diplomatic institution. The last thing they will do is to be the one to cause the panic. So they will massage the situation and speak to you as it is. I recognize that. And it's important we are all appreciate it. That is their job, and they are good at doing that. So I give them that opportunity to do what they have to do. But my question is, as a country, ourselves, without waiting for the IMF to give us a verdict that we all know, as I said, toss it, do whatever you want to do with it, our debt is unsustainable. We need to have a national discussion on how to make our debt sustainable. Because the first thing is, after identifying that the debt is unsustainable, how do you make it sustainable before you get an IMF program? You need to agree on the debt relief that you require. If you need 20%, 30%, 40% of your GDP in a form of debt relief, that brings the question is, who will bear that burden? How are you going to burden share? Are you going to tackle external, domestic, or everybody else? Are you going to add official, bilateral, or not? At that point, you need to make a decision. And will debt restructuring alone do the trick? Because remember, debt restructuring deals only with commercial debt holders. So if you are going to deal with official, bilateral, and export credit agency, you need more than debt restructuring. Okay. You will need what we call debt service suspension initiative under the common framework. So that will mean you will need a double do. Okay. A double do. So the situation is not as simple as we think it is. And I'm urging the government to start talking to the right people. People in academia. We have excellent people out there. And in this country, we are blessed with people with knowledge. The academia is big. You can tap into their knowledge. Civil society. And even the political divide. Across the political divide. And pick knowledge. Let's sit down and confront the situation at the national level. Unfortunately, they are dealing with it at the partisan level and political party level. That isn't helpful. The situation goes beyond politics. We need to rescue our country because this is all what we have. And the situation is getting bad by the day. Ayisha, I am worried. Let me be honest with you. Because what I see coming, the trend that I see coming is scary. We need to confront it. We can't sit unconcerned, allow one government to believe that I'm the one ruling, and so for that matter, we should allow whatever to happen to this country. No, we need to confront it as such.
So fundamentally, I mean, there's one group of people or a group of people who will be at the center of this whole projection and all the issues that we are talking about. That is the ordinary Ghanaian. Dr. Theo Champong, what's the effect of this projection on the ordinary Ghanaian?
I mean, I think we're already seeing some of the effects of the liquidity squeeze that we're seeing, and also more or less the ineffectiveness of even the central banks, policy rate hikes in controlling inflation, right, in the country. And by and large, you see cost of living having gone up, through the roof. And by the way, this 104%, 105% projection we're seeing in comparative terms would be the biggest number we've seen since 2001 when we actually entered the HIPC program. So in the space of about 20 years, and with the multilateral debt relief that we received, we would have almost gone back to HIPC, right, debt levels if these projections are to be believed and to come back. But importantly, the effect and the point that the Honorable makes really is, if the DSA that is done by the IMF, and remember that the IMF and the World Bank actually use a similar framework in doing their debt sustainability analysis, and this is widely publicly available. So if the DSA comes to a conclusion that our debt is unsustainable and is already in some form of distress, then clearly you have to restructure the debt. And the question is, where does that burden really fall in that regard? And I have actually argued that if we attempt to only do domestic debt restructuring, that could really, for me, compromise the viability of the financial sector in the country. So we know that the commercial banks in the country hold roughly about 55 billion or 9.2 billion, right, which is about 30% of the domestic debt, right, of the country. But in terms of exposure, that's about 31% of the total banking sector assets we have as of 2021. And remember, again, we spent a little over 20 billion just cleaning up, these banks just a few years ago. So if you restructure this debt, either by way of haircuts or trying to extend the tenure and duration without offering any compensating policy action, then that is going to lead to further distress within the sector, and it's going to affect the asset quality of the banks. And of course, they need to make a higher provision in terms of their impairment. So the non-performing loans would be much higher than the 14% that we currently have. So again, let me give you one number. Let's assume that on the domestic front, we're going to do a 20% right discount or haircut, then the total write-off in question here would be 20% of 55. So we're talking almost 11 billion Ghana cedis. And that's about 44% of what we used in cleaning up the banking sector a few years ago. So it's more going to become like a cost 90 exercise in that regard. And that, again, has a major impact on the financial soundness, the capital adequacy ratios of the banks, and importantly, we would see further liquidity constraints and the banks not even being able to lend to the real sector or the private sector of the economy. In my view, we need to have a comprehensive debt restructuring, which would also include the external debt. And we have an opportunity to actually do this under the G20 common framework. And just to clarify a point that Honorable made, the DSSI, the Debt Suspension Service Initiative, actually came to an end, and that's been replaced by the G20 common framework going forward. Zambia has been able to do that and bring all the creditors together, commercial, multilateral, bilateral, to agree on some restructuring going forward, but in a way that the burden is shared evenly amongst all the creditors. That's where I think, subject to that DSA analysis by the IMF, we eventually probably will end up having to go.
Professor Ibe, Ato agrees, and Dr. Theo Champong agrees that indeed, and I'm sure you also agree, that if we do not want to get to this 104%, we definitely can do something before the end of the year. What can we do locally to ensure that we do not get there?
Well, I think as of now, the options are quite limited, to be honest, because the time is too short for any policy to take effect and begin to yield results. But going forward, I think that this issue of debt unsustainability, has been with us for a while now. I would say that the cause can be attributed to both remote causes and then the immediate causes, right? The remote one, which is largely to do with the fundamentals of this country, the weakness in our economic structure, which does not help us to have very robust productive capacity to be able to generate more, to export more, to generate more tax revenue for the states, where it stands like tax to GDP is one of the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa, around 13% thereabout. Definitely, and that if you juxtapose that on the fact that government expenditures are often high, actually to meet the social and development needs of the country, and also the loopholes in our public financial management system where graft and corruptions and fiscal indiscipline all put together, then it means that over time we'll be accumulating these debts, which have now breached it. This weakness in the fundamentals was aggravated right from the energy crisis that we went into, financial crisis that we went into, and been worsened by the COVID and then the Ukraine war. We cannot, of course, take out those ones because definitely it provides some kind of shock that if your foundation is not strong, you will not be able to stand. And so tackling this largely for me will be to now look beyond just addressing the surface of the issue to try to obtain some kind of debt sustainable level to get the IMF program going. I think as a country, this calls for us to do a lot more soul searching. We need to search our souls and to see where really are we going wrong as a country and what can you do to turn the corner. Because I think for far too long we've been at this point, and this point has been worse than many of the previous ones that we've gone into. So largely we need to be more aggressive, particularly with domestic revenue generation to support our development program, other than over-relying on borrowing and aid and all those kind of things will definitely will not help us. So how do we expand and generate more revenue from the domestic economy? That for me is what we have to begin to have a dialogue around. And this should be non-partisan, as Honorable mentioned, that all of us have to put our shoulders to the wheels and begin to think deeply, what can we do as a nation to up our tax to GDP to about 20%? That will support huge expenditure, the huge infrastructure and social needs that we have, to support the vulnerable society in terms of social safety net and social protection. That will make sure that they are also protected. I think this provides good opportunity for us to begin to do that kind of soul searching and think deeply on how to mobilize enough revenue. Otherwise, government will go, government will come, and will still be coming, having within that kind of roller coaster.
And I'm happy that the politicians are beginning to realize that this is gone beyond politics. Atu just admitted to that, and I'm happy. Atu, how do we mitigate the effects so that we can be sustainable? Or is it that debt restructuring is on the table?
Ayisha, the government has no choice than to restructure the debt in a very comprehensive manner. Because if, for instance, it is determined that Ghana needed, for instance, 50% of your GDP in a form of debt relief, the burden cannot necessarily be on domestic debt holders because the impact on the economy will be severe, particularly on the financial sector, which all of us don't want it to go down. This will mean that the restructuring should be comprehensive. Probably you may have to include arrests onto contractors. So that is the kind of conversation that we should all have to mitigate the situation. I call it burden share. So you share the burden evenly. So I am saying that the government must start the conversation of a possible restructuring. And then the restructure envelope must be comprehensive. No one, obviously no one, based on the numbers that I have seen, can run away from this. The government's attitude of trying to hide it from the public and trying to use PL to say that we are not there yet, meanwhile we are there, eventually we will be there. Today, Ayisha, when they took office, Ghana's public debt to GDP was 55%. They've run it to 104% by the end of 2022. This means that they have increased the debt to GDP by approximately 100%. At a time that Ghana's GDP has grown. So obviously, it is the attitude of government borrowings that is causing this. When they took office, tax revenue as a percentage to the percentage of your tax revenue that you use for debt servicing was about 66%. Today, you need about 90% of your tax revenue to service your debt, obviously because of government attitude of overborrowing.
Okay.
So we need to pull the brakes. And I have said that when Parliament resumes, we in the minority, we are going to make a decision. The decision is not to approve any more loan for this administration.
Okay.
Because it is this debt that has sunk us down and down and down and down. We don't want to stop, to continue going down. The digging must stop. So that's our position.
In the interim, I mean, within, from now till about November, what do you think government should do?
You see, first of all, they need to seek stability. You see, when you stabilize the economy, the city will stop depreciating.
Okay.
And then it will not have impact on the foreign debt.
On the foreign
as
debt.
a percentage to your GDP.
All right.
That's
so,
one. And then number two, they have to pull the brakes. They have to stop the borrowing. It's just too much.
Okay.
They are going overboard.
Well, this is a conversation that has just started because, look, the country's debt affects everybody in the country and it affects your pockets, my pockets. So it's a conversation that we'll be monitoring. Ato has just indicated that when they go back to Parliament, there's a conversation that will happen on this. We're also monitoring the IMF negotiations. All of this is a conversation that will continue till we see the head and tail of this whole thing. I'm grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Casey Alatofosin for coming. Professor Eric Sibe, I'm grateful. And Dr. Thuy Champong, thanks so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of our program.